Nyasha Cole was 27 years old. She worked irregular hours as a rideshare driver and freelance makeup assistant, moving between short-term gigs without a fixed schedule. Friends described her as controlled in conversation, careful with wording, attentive to how things sounded when repeated later. She lived alone in a rented one-bedroom apartment on the east side of the city, paid for mostly in cash. Nyasha kept a handwritten planner instead of a digital calendar and avoided posting about her personal life online. She was transgender, a fact she disclosed selectively, and she was known for keeping documentation, screenshots, receipts, recordings, organized in labeled folders on her phone. She told one friend she did this because memory isn't evidence. She had been saving money to relocate to another state by the end of the year. Terrence Wolfe was 42 years old, married, and employed as a regional logistics manager for a commercial supply company. His work involved frequent late meetings, irregular hours, and a plausible reason to be away from home without advance notice. Colleagues described him as methodical and cautious, someone who avoided email when a phone call would suffice, and avoided phone calls when an in-person conversation was possible. He had no public social media accounts under his own name. Terrence lived with his wife in a single-family home in a quiet residential neighborhood. He was known to keep his phone on silent and to carry a secondary prepaid device for work-related contacts. Laverne Wolfe was 39 years old. She managed scheduling and billing for a dental practice and was responsible for overseeing office compliance. Co-workers described her as calm, organized, and unreactive under pressure. She was active in a local church and volunteered twice a month at a food pantry. Laverne maintained a detailed household budget and tracked expenses in spreadsheets going back several years. She had no criminal record and no prior involvement with private investigators or civil litigation beyond routine workplace matters. She and Terrence had been married for 11 years and had no children. Imani Brooks was 31 years old and worked in digital content moderation for a third-party contractor. Her job required reviewing flagged videos and images, categorizing content, and escalating policy violations. Outside of work, she was regarded as socially active and well-connected, often acting as an intermediary between people who did not know each other directly. She had known Nyasha for approximately 4 years. The two met through mutual friends and stayed in intermittent contact, exchanging messages several times a week during some periods and going silent for months at a time. Imani was considered technically skilled, especially with file formats, metadata, and basic video editing tools. She lived with a roommate and had significant unsecured personal debt. Roland Pierce was 48 years old, a licensed private investigator operating as a sole proprietor. He previously worked in insurance fraud investigations before opening his own practice. His work consisted primarily of surveillance, documentation, and background checks. Pierce maintained a standard evidence intake protocol, logging times, locations, and equipment used. He had a reputation for discretion and for delivering materials exactly as contracted, without interpretation or recommendation. He lived alone and worked almost exclusively on referral. Detective Aaron Bell was 46 years old and had been with the department for 20 years. He specialized in cases involving digital evidence and financial records. Bell was known among colleagues for his attention to file integrity and chain of custody rather than interrogation theatrics. He kept printed case timelines annotated by hand and cross-checked them against raw data. At home, he cared for an elderly parent and maintained a rigid routine that limited overtime whenever possible. The first documented contact between Nyasha Cole and Terrence Wolfe occurred 8 months before her death. It was not direct. A mutual acquaintance introduced them during a private gathering where phones were left in another room. Terrence presented himself without a last name and explained his preference for discretion early. Nyasha accepted the condition. From the outset, communication followed a rule-based structure. No saved numbers under real names, no written messages describing intent, no photographs together, no locations repeated on a schedule. Meetings were arranged through short, transactional calls or through intermediaries who did not know the full context. This structure served Terrence's priorities. It also created a pattern Nyasha noticed. Each precaution reduced traceability but increased asymmetry. Terrence controlled timing and access. Nyasha adjusted. She kept notes after each meeting, dates, places, arrival, and departure windows. She did not record conversations. She logged behaviors. Over time, she observed that promises were phrased conditionally and never repeated verbatim. There was no explicit agreement, only accumulation. 3 months into the arrangement, Terrence disclosed that he was married. The disclosure came after Nyasha had already invested time and secrecy. She did not respond immediately. Instead, she began preserving more information. Receipts from parking meters. ATM withdrawal times that matched Terrence's stated whereabouts. A voice memo describing how arrangements were made, recorded alone without his participation. These materials were not used. They were stored. Laverne Wolfe learned of the affair through a discrepancy, not a confession. She noticed a recurring cash withdrawal that did not correspond with household expenses. She did not confront Terrence directly. Instead, she reviewed phone records and found gaps rather than evidence. The absence of data was consistent. That consistency suggested intention. Laverne hired Roland Pierce with a limited brief. Confirm or disprove infidelity. Document only what could be verified. Avoid direct contact. Pierce's surveillance established a pattern without naming a participant. Terrence met the same individual multiple times, but the person's identity was not immediately clear. Pierce logged locations, times, vehicle descriptions. He provided reports to Laverne weekly. The information did not prompt confrontation. It prompted planning. Laverne did not file for divorce or alter shared finances. She continued normal routines.
Nyasha became aware that she was being observed when a location she had not shared appeared in Terrence's next call.
The implication was indirect. She adjusted again.
She began to consider the information she held not as documentation, but as currency.
Her financial situation was unstable.
She had medical expenses not fully covered by insurance and was behind on rent.
Terrence declined requests framed as needs.
He responded differently to statements framed as risk.
Nyasha discussed this shift with Imani Brooks. The conversation occurred over 2 meetings and several calls. Nyasha described the material she had collected and her assessment that they could influence behavior without being released. Imani advised caution, but also suggested that timing mattered. Imani offered to hold a copy of any recording as insurance. She framed this as protection against retaliation, not leverage. The idea of a recorded statement developed gradually. Nyasha drafted talking points in her planner. She revised them twice. She removed emotional language and focused on verifiable facts. The goal was not exposure. It was control. The recording would exist without being used, creating a constraint on others' actions. Nyasha believed that possession alone would stabilize the situation. This assumption narrowed her options. Once the decision to record was made, delay increased risk. She scheduled the recording for a night when Terrence was out of town, and Pierce's surveillance logs showed no activity near her residence. She sent a message to Imani confirming the plan and asking her to keep the file unchanged if it was ever needed. In the weeks leading up to the recording, the balance Nyasha Cole believed she had achieved began to erode. Terrence Wolfe reduced contact frequency and shortened meetings. The change followed no explicit disagreement. It followed the quiet completion of Roland Pierce's assignment. Pierce delivered his final report to Laverne Wolfe 4 weeks before Nyasha's death. The report contained no names, only corroborated patterns and still images taken from a distance. Laverne paid the remaining balance in cash and requested no further services. After that point, Terrence altered his behavior. He stopped using intermediaries and began initiating contact himself, but less often. When Nyasha referenced previous assurances, he did not contradict them. He reframed them as misunderstandings. The absence of records made the reframing possible. Nyasha responded by tightening her own documentation. She added timestamps to notes and stored backups on a secondary device. She did not inform Terrence of these measures. Nyasha's financial position worsened. 2 rideshare accounts suspended her for unrelated customer disputes. A medical bill went to collections. She requested assistance from Terrence once, directly. He declined and reminded her that discretion protected both of them. The statement clarified the hierarchy. Nyasha did not argue. She began finalizing the recording instead. During this period, communication with Imani Brooks increased. Phone records show calls lasting under 3 minutes, often late at night. Nyasha described the situation as closing in. Imani reiterated the importance of control over release. She suggested that a clear narrative would limit misinterpretation if the file ever surfaced. Nyasha adjusted the script again, removing speculation and narrowing references to 2 names only. One element remained unresolved: money. Nyasha added a single sentence addressing financial pressure and prior discussions about compensation for silence. She recorded multiple takes, stopping after each to listen for tone rather than content. She selected the version that sounded least reactive. Metadata later showed the final file was created at 11:12 p.m. The choice of location was deliberate. Nyasha parked in a residential area 2 blocks from her apartment, not associated with any prior meetings. The car faced away from street cameras. She framed the shot tightly to avoid identifiable surroundings. She spoke steadily and did not look directly at the lens for long periods. The recording lasted just under 6 minutes. At 11:21 page M, Nyasha sent the file to Imani Brooks using an encrypted transfer service. The accompanying message instructed Imani to keep the file intact and not to share it unless Nyasha failed to check in by morning. There was no instruction to contact police. There was no accusation. The message framed the file as insurance, not evidence. What Nyasha could not account for was the compression of timelines that followed. Laverne Wolfe had access to Pierce's logs and Terrence's movements. Terrence was aware that his margin for error had narrowed. Imani Brooks now possessed a file whose value depended on sequence, not content. Each party acted within their perceived constraints. Those actions converged within an hour. At 11:48 p.m., Nyasha exited her vehicle. Her phone remained inside. Surveillance cameras on a nearby arterial road captured her car stationary for several minutes after she left. No footage showed her destination. At 12:37 a.m., a patrol unit noted the vehicle still parked, engine cold, driver's door ajar. At 12:14 a.m., a private security camera behind a closed auto parts store registered motion in its peripheral range. The footage did not capture faces. It recorded a brief interruption in ambient light, followed by movement consistent with 2 people crossing the lot. The timestamp was later corroborated by a nearby traffic sensor that registered a momentary slowdown without a corresponding vehicle stop. Nyasha Cole's body was discovered at 6:02 a.m. by an employee opening a neighboring business. The location was partially shielded from the street. The injuries were inconsistent with a random assault. There were no signs of robbery. Personal items were missing, but her phone remained in the vehicle 2 blocks away. The medical examiner estimated time of death between 12:20 and 12:45 a.m. By 7:30 a.m., the video Nyasha recorded was circulating online. It appeared on 2 platforms within minutes of each other, uploaded from accounts created the same morning. The file showed no visible compression artifacts. It appeared intact. Within hours, it was reframed as a confession tied directly to motive. Commentary focused on the named individuals. Context was absent. Detective Aaron Bell received the case at 9:10 a.m. He began with file comparison rather than witness interviews. A forensic copy of Nyasha's phone was obtained under warrant. The original video file was recovered from local storage and cloud cache. Bell noted a discrepancy. The original file contained an additional sentence near the end, referencing prior discussions about money and leverage. The version circulating publicly did not. The omission was clean. There were no splice marks. The audio waveform showed a smooth transition, consistent with a deliberate edit rather than corruption. Metadata indicated the edited version was rendered at 1:03 a.m., 42 minutes after Nyasha sent the original file to Imani Brooks. Bell interviewed Terrence Wolfe first. Terrence provided an alibi involving a late-night meeting that could not be fully confirmed. His phone showed minimal activity during the relevant window. The pattern was consistent with prior behavior. Bell noted it and moved on. Laverne Wolfe acknowledged hiring Roland Pierce and receiving his reports. She provided payment records and access to emails. She denied any contact with Nyasha. Pierce corroborated her account and produced his logs. None placed Laverne near the scene. When Bell interviewed Imani Brooks, she confirmed receiving the video and delaying contact with authorities. She stated she edited the file only to remove irrelevant material before sharing it, believing the rest would be misinterpreted. Bell asked why the edit occurred before Nyasha was reported missing. Imani did not answer immediately. Her phone records showed a cash withdrawal at 12:58 a.m. from an ATM 3 blocks from the auto parts store. The sequence fixed the case's trajectory. The recording had not failed as insurance. It had succeeded in creating leverage. The failure occurred in assuming that leverage would remain aligned with Nyasha's interests once control left her possession. Bell requested additional warrants. From that point forward, the investigation no longer centered on the affair itself, but on the management of information in the narrow window between recording and death. The warrants authorized a focused sweep: financial records, device histories, location data, and platform access logs limited to the 90-minute window surrounding Nyasha Cole's death. Detective Aaron Bell structured the review by minute markers rather than narratives. The objective was to determine control transitions, who had access to which asset and when. Imani Brooks's devices were imaged first. Her primary phone showed the encrypted transfer receipt at 11:21 p.m. The file was opened at 12:01 a.m. A local copy was created at 12:02 a.m. Editing software was launched at 12:07 a.m. The render completed at 1:03 a.m. Upload logs matched the public release times. No crash reports or corruption flags were present. The edit removed a single sentence and shortened the runtime by 9 seconds. Bank records showed Imani's cash withdrawal at 12:58 a.m. The ATM camera captured her alone. The withdrawal amount matched no known bill or scheduled payment. A second deposit, cash, appeared in her account 2 days later, structured to avoid automatic reporting thresholds. Bell did not infer source. He noted sequence. Terrence Wolf's alibi was tested against traffic cameras and license plate readers. His vehicle did not approach the auto parts store or Nyasha's apartment area that night. Phone pings placed him across town during the estimated time of death. The data aligned with his statement. No evidence placed him near the scene. Laverne Wolf's activity logs were similarly consistent. She remained at home. Her communications during the window were limited to routine messages. Pierce's logs and GPS data confirmed he was inactive that night. None of their records intersected with the ATM location or the upload IP addresses. Attention returned to the missing sentence. The original audio referenced prior discussions about compensation in exchange for continued discretion and stated that Nyasha had declined a specific offer earlier that week. The edited version removed that context, leaving only the existence of the affair and the named parties. The removal converted the file from a statement about leverage into a narrative of motive. Bell conducted a second interview with Imani. He presented the render timestamps, the ATM footage, and the deposit pattern. Imani acknowledged editing the file before sharing it. She stated that she believed the omitted sentence would undermine Nyasha's credibility. When asked about the cash, she said it was unrelated and declined further explanation on advice of counsel. The medical examiner's report was finalized. Cause of death was blunt force trauma. There were no defensive injuries consistent with a prolonged struggle. The scene suggested a brief encounter. No DNA matched Terrence or Laverne. Trace evidence was insufficient to identify a third party. Bell compiled a timeline showing that the edited file was released while Nyasha's status was unknown, before any public report of a crime. The release preceded the discovery of the body. The edit altered public interpretation and redirected initial suspicion. The delay in contacting authorities and the monetized sequence formed a coherent pattern. The case file shifted categories. What began as a suspected crime of passion was reframed as a controlled act tied to information brokerage. Bell submitted his findings to the district attorney with a recommendation aligned to that framework. The evidentiary chain was intact. The question was no longer who had reason to be angry, but who benefited from deciding which truth survived first contact. The district attorney filed charges 9 months after Nyasha Cole's death. Imani Brooks was indicted on counts of second-degree murder, tampering with evidence, and obstruction of justice. The charging document did not allege a crime of passion or spontaneous violence. It described a narrow sequence of acts: receipt of a recording explicitly framed as insurance, selective alteration of that recording, delayed notification to authorities, financial activity inconsistent with routine behavior, and a confrontation occurring within a defined time window before Nyasha's death. Pretrial motions focused on admissibility. Defense counsel argued that the video edit constituted protected judgment, not manipulation, and that the financial records were circumstantial. The court admitted both. The judge ruled that the timing and sequence of the edit, release, and cash activity were inseparable from the alleged conduct and relevant to intent. At trial, the prosecution presented the case as a mechanism rather than a story. Jurors were shown synchronized timelines, file metadata aligned with ATM footage, upload logs aligned with traffic camera timestamps, and phone inactivity aligned with the estimated time of death. The missing sentence from the video was played in its original context, then contrasted with the public version. A forensic analyst testified that the omission required deliberate action and could not occur accidentally. Terrence Wolf and Laverne Wolf testified briefly. Neither was treated as a focal point. Their testimony established boundaries, where they were, what they knew, and what they did not do. Roland Pierce testified to his logs and to the limits of his assignment. Detective Aaron Bell testified last, walking the jury through the evidentiary chain and the moment the case reframed from jealousy to control of information. The defense did not dispute that Imani edited the file or delayed contact. They disputed causation. They argued that no direct evidence placed Imani at the scene of the killing and that the prosecution's theory relied on inference. The court instructed the jury on circumstantial evidence and on the standard of proof. After 4 days of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on all counts. At sentencing, the court cited the calculated nature of the acts and the exploitation of trust. Imani Brooks was sentenced to 32 years in state prison with eligibility for parole after 24. Civil proceedings followed. Nyasha Cole's family filed a wrongful death suit that was settled without admission of liability. The platforms that hosted the edited video revised their handling of posthumous uploads but did not alter moderation timelines. No departmental policies regarding evidence escrow or third-party file custody were changed.